You may have guessed from my title, I'm not a HPE teacher, so I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. I've worked in a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander school for the last 17 years as an occupational therapist, so that's, I guess, where I'm going to draw some of the information that I'm going to talk about today. And I also studied my PhD in the School of Human Movement Studies at UQ, under Doon actually, and so I guess I'm drawing on those two experiences in what I'm going to share today. So when we think about taking a strengths-based approach, I think it's also helpful to understand what a deficit-focused approach looks like as well. Because sometimes we sort of hear the word deficit and we think that's a negative thing, and I think it's good to unpack both things simultaneously. So when I think about a deficit-focused approach, I often think about it, particularly in the work that I do, as a statistical picture. So often if I'm thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, which is where I work now, the deficit focus is all about the statistical picture. You know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a huge gap in life expectancy, poorer health outcomes, poorer education outcomes, and on it goes. So often the statistical picture, whilst being evidence, can create I think, a deficit focus for the people that we're working at, whether it be people in low SES areas, whatever it might be. And it's very much focused, as you know, on the health risks. And what I have certainly found in my PhD work is that the young people that I've worked with don't see themselves as at risk. So coming at education from a risk perspective is kind of counterproductive, I think. Conversely, a strengths-based approach is really about making healthy, safe and active choices. This is straight out of the curriculum document. I think importantly, it focuses on individuals within a community context. So it's not an individual on its own, on his or her own, but an individual within a community, and that community also impacting on the individual. Fairly self-explanatory, but a strengths-based approach focuses on an individual's existing strengths and resources, but also, going back to the point before, the strengths and resources of the community in which they live and how that can help. And it also recognises that the context will impact on wellbeing and opportunities. You know, and I think that's really important, and you would see that in your everyday work, that you have students who come to you, or even the school itself that you work in has particular resources that are available, particular opportunities that are available because of the context that you're in. So in thinking about this, I'm a pretty practical person. I like to do, and I think when I started to think about, well, what does this look like in practice? What would this look like if you were at work? I think a deficit focus often comes from a well-meaning perspective. So, you know, we talked about the statistical picture. Often that's a motivator of, I have a 12-year-old son, and he just had to do a talk on Charles Perkins, and, you know, he was outraged at the injustice of the 1960s, you know, and so he was very focused on, you know, the problems of the time. And I think that often that's the incentive for us, is that, you know, we want to make a change. We see a problem, we want to do something about it. So I believe that often, even when we're coming from that deficit focus, it's from a well-meaning sort of point. However, a deficit focus also assumes problems. And for example, you know, in my case, it's often assuming that, you know, I'm doing well here, dropping things all over the floor, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students are poor, you know, in health or education or wellbeing, whatever it be. It also ignores diversity. You know, for instance, when I was talking to my deputy CEO, who's an Aboriginal woman, you know, about this upcoming presentation, she said, oh, you know, just tell them that it's not all about sport. You know, that not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are into sport. They don't like sport. But often when we're coming from that deficit focus, it's a lump everybody in together, and it ignores that diversity. And I think also, coming from a deficit focus, you know, how do we measure what a deficit is, what a risk is, what a problem is? It's usually because we're using the white Western middle class norm as the measuring stick. That's what we're measuring everybody else against. And I think that's problematic in and of itself as well. Chelsea Bond, who's an Aboriginal academic from the University of Queensland, she did her PhD looking at the Inala community from a strengths-based perspective. And this was what she said as part of her work, is that, you know, often when we think about identity and we think about that statistical picture for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, it's all those things I said before. But for her, Aboriginality is about pride, strength, determination and survival. So why are we focusing on all these, impairment, hopelessness, etc.? When I did my PhD, I talked to the young people in my study. I followed a bunch of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from primary school into early high school and met up with them about every 3 months and talked about, how they felt about health and physical activity. And when I got to the end of my PhD, I talked with them about, well, how do you feel about me sharing some of the information you shared with me with other people? And this is what one of the girls said, is that she thought it was really good that I was doing this because not all Aboriginals sniff paint and get drunk every weekend. And I think for our students, they often have quite a sophisticated awareness of that deficit-focused picture. And in her case, she had an awareness of how she might be perceived because of who she was. And also an awareness of the stereotypes, I think. So these are, again, some of the pieces that have come out of the research that I've done, and you can see there's different stereotypes that are being disrupted or also bought into. The young people in my study were really aware of the consequences of not eating well or being active, but they didn't define their health as being at risk. And they didn't adopt sort of health crisis messages. So if we're thinking about a strengths-based approach, I think the first thing is that it doesn't assume that people are coming with a particular anything. It identifies opportunities to highlight the strengths of the individuals. A strengths-based approach recognises and promotes diversity in experience, in knowledge and in context. And it really problematises that idea of a white Western middle-class norm, making space for multiple identities, multiple values, multiple interests, and highlights good practice. And I want to use as a very brief example the Deadly Choices program, which comes out of the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health. It's a whole raft of things, but it's a really good example of coming from a strengths-based approach. It's developed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for all of the community, but specifically focusing obviously on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it becomes the norm. So the norm is around the deadly choices. I want to give you 2 examples of how it might work. So these are 2 young people who were in my study. Willie, who was at the time in Year 9, on a football rugby league scholarship, aspiring to be a professional footballer, sees himself as a leader and a potential role model. So, you can see how easy it would be to use a strengths-based approach with somebody like Willie. Jayden, on the other hand, was in Year 9 at an urban school, played no formal or organised sport, doesn't like football, you can see his quote there, but rides his push bike and motorbike, doesn't really see that as physical activity, it's just something he does because he has to get around, eats lots of junk food, plays lots of computer games, and sport really isn't part of his identity. And I guess when I started to think about, well, how do you use a strengths-based approach across, multiple people who are going to be in your classrooms, Deadly Choices is something that I think is a really useful tool. So you could ask both of these boys, what's your deadly choice? So deadly being good and positive, just in case people weren't aware. Sorry, should have said that at the beginning, shouldn't I? And I think, again, that's a really good example of a strengths-based approach, is that you're using a word that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids use, being deadly, as cool, rad, mad, sick, whatever young people use these days. That's deadly. So using a word that's even lingo is, I think, using a strengths-based approach. But you could ask both those boys, what's your deadly choice? And they can come at that in their own way, with their own perspective, but you're drawing on their existing strengths and their existing resiliences. You could also ask, what does making a deadly choice impact on your community and your family? How can we unpack that in a lesson? How can we work towards, building on those deadly choices? And I think that strengths-based kind of approach draws on those things. So these are some of the implications, I guess, that came out of my thinking around this. Thanks.